Thanks everyone, thanks for having us, it's wonderful to be here. Some of you might know us, David and I began our research careers really here in Laureate land in the top end. In my background's medical, public health and air pollution epidemiology, and I now lead an NHMRC Centre of Research Excellence in air pollution, the Centre for Safe Air around the country, amongst a few other projects. And David is, we can introduce himself, but Professor of Pyrogeography and Fire Science, University of Tasmania. So we're now based on the island of Laureate, now known as Tasmania, lands of the Palawa and Pakana peoples. So we gave a fairly provocative title, Air Pollution Capital of Australia, and we'll speak to that a bit, but we'll split the talk between us a bit. So I'll speak a bit to some of the historical air quality and some of the reconstructions done by my centre and our research team. And then I'll give a bit more detail on the health impacts, because the science since I began sort of 25, 30 years ago has really come a long way since then on how air quality affects your health. And then I'll hand to David to talk about links between fires, climate and air quality and management levers of that. So let's see how this works. Photo from last night. Okay, so this is failing to advance. Okay. Shall I just ask you when I'd like you to?
It should work.
Oh,
Try again.
There's a lag, I think.
a lag. Okay, lovely. Okay, so this is some work done by our centre. So this is just a broad brush looking at each jurisdiction around the country. And it's looking at air pollution measured as fine particles, PM2.5, which is one of the main ones for population health. And it's box plots of every statistical area too, roughly the size of a suburb, I guess, or a bit bigger, and the distribution. So the middle line is the median, the end of the box plots are the 25th and 75th centiles, and then the two extremes are the 5th and 95th centiles. So you can see the clustering and the range of air pollution around the country. The line at 5, the red line, is the World Health Organization guideline for annual average air quality, which most places in the world don't meet. So that's, but Australia does better than most. The blue line on the right is our Australian standard for annual air quality, and it's divided urban and rural. Blue is urban centres and green is rural centres. So I thought it might be fun for you, but they've revealed it a few times, to guess where the NT might fit nationally in this very broad brush measure. And if I click and nothing happens, so I wait patiently. Is that the idea? It will remove there. Okay, I think I need to point it at you actually.
Sorry, yeah, it might be a little bit slow, but
yeah. So you can see just broad brush, we're an outlier, right? So we are the air pollution capital, and it's not surprising we're in a tropical savanna. It's the most fire-prone type of biome on Earth. So any town in this, you know, biome in Australia would take the cake as well. Okay, now let's look in more detail at Darwin. And this is available online through our centre, but we developed a system called, it's still in progress, but it is of our health star ratings for air quality around Australia, because EPAs do report against benchmarks, yes or no, but the reports tend to come 2 or 3 years later, and there's not a lot of good tools for people to see what's going on year by year. And in fact, the variation beneath the standard is where all the big public health impacts happen. There's no safe lower level. So in fact, understanding that variation helps you understand where you are in relation to other places for your long-term health, if you're wanting to think about that. So we've got 40 air stations around the country. This is data for 2023. And actually most places, if you get 3 or more, you're better than average and you've got really good air quality. Yellow, 2 to 2.5 stars is kind of average for Australia. Those who are really struggling have less than 2 stars. And I'll just show you Darwin. So this is a Palmerston station, so you can explore all this online when you go. And I'll just go through the 5 criteria that give you 5 stars. And you can see how Palmerston Air Monitor performed last year. So the average PM2.5 was 8.7. If you meet Australia's air quality standard, you'll get half a star. If you meet the WHO standard, you'll get a full star. that if you're not over that 5-year historic period meeting Australia's standard on average, you don't get a star. Then last year, so that's the previous 5 years, then 2023, which is the year of interest for this, 12.2, so that's actually a big jump, not meeting any standard. So no stars for that, and the fact that it's got worse compared to the 5-year, because the philosophy now is continual reduction. It's not, there's no threshold where it's safe or unsafe, it's continual reduction. So if you're getting worse, you don't get a star. Then there's high pollution days. So these are individual days. Days above Australia's air quality standard, that's just a 24-hour standard of 25. If there's more than 10, there's no stars. If there's 0 to 5, there's half a star. So Palmerston had 36 days above our daily air quality standard. Indicative data, EPAs take a couple of years because they check it. This is the real-time data, so the final report may have some minor differences. Days with moderate pollution exceed the WHO guideline, but not our standard. So 60 days, so that's 90 days of quite elevated air pollution. So that's why Darwin tends to either get half a star or no stars. And you can go back the last sort of few years. And then this is from the most recent EPA report, which is for 2021. And this is where they report the number of exceedances of the daily standard. And they look back through time. And you can see these ones in blue were actually set up by David and I. We got an ARC grant and we were the first people to measure air quality for PM 2.5, and then the EPA took over. But if you look at this, it does look alarming, right? You can see before 2012, number of exceedances were between 0 and 5, and then you can see a general increase. Where there's 3 bars where there's 3 stations, you could probably take the average. But it does look like a step change, and that looks alarming. But I don't want to overcall that because our instrumental record really only goes to 2004. That's a very short time. But we've done, and haven't got time to go into it now, but we've done historical reconstructions based on well-validated models. And I can show you, which should reassure you a little bit. Whoops, now it's going fast. This is number of exceedances based on a reconstructed model since 1960. So you can see we're in a savanna. It's going to fluctuate a lot with weather and fire. And this line, the blue line, is the 10-year moving average. I'm really not going to do that. But you can see a general worsening trend and loss. I mean, I usually, as part of my acknowledgement of country, whenever I talk about fire, I do make the comment that all the evidence we have is the best from air pollution, which is my field, least polluting fire regimes, a traditional Aboriginal fire management, and we've gradually lost that. But then we do see a step change right at the end where the number of exceedances seem to be going up again. And that's, well, that corresponds with changes in land management that David will talk about. This is counting number of exceedances, right? This is the extremes. It's much easier to see trends with extremes than looking, David will show you, looking at the mean, it's much slower. And with such background variation, you don't see the trends as clearly as you do with this. Okay, and this is modelled mortality by year attributable to our dry season fire, smoke, air pollution in Darwin by year from 2001. So basically, for that decade, it was an average of 15 deaths a year. This is applying known relationships. It's not me looking at actual death records, so it's estimated. But the last 10 years, it's been about an average of 20 deaths a year. The economic burden of that is actually quite huge. If you take value, loss of life and economic valuation of the costs, it's around 100 million each year. So working on air pollution, even an incremental decrease, has huge health benefits. Okay, so I'm now going to move more into a health talk and how air pollution affects health. And I'll make a quick comment about the photos. I've got 2 sorts of photos, either ones we've purchased from stock images for talks. Every other photo, so that's this one. The other photos are all photos that I've taken of family and friends who've all explicitly given permission for me to share them in forums such as these. And that's the top one. In fact, there's someone in the room in that photo, but I won't say who. So let's think about what happens. We breathe in air and it's got a bit of smoke in it. The point about air, it's 11 to 13,000 litres every day we inhale. The very fine particles go into our bloodstream. So basically from conception until we die, whatever is in the air is in us. It's in placentas, it's in brains, you can find the particles. And they have a series of effects. And at the individual level, these effects are actually quite tiny, but they're there and they're a continual stimulus of our immune and stress responses. So let's think about the smoke itself, what's in it. So smoke, product of combustion. Combustion is basically hydrocarbons, you give it some energy, it combines with oxygen, it gives off energy. And if it's 100% complete, combustion efficiency, all the carbon in the log will be CO2 in the air, right, with water vapour. It's never that, right? Particularly smouldering combustion, you never get complete, you get a lot of products. There's multiple processes, there's pyrolysis first, then there's combustion, and you get hundreds of chemicals which are products of incomplete combustion. A lot of other stuff. And you can show it this way. Various hydrocarbons, they're actually all pretty similar when you burn them. The combustion conditions and the air-fuel ratios determine all the other stuff and products of combustion. And smouldering combustion, like you get with log fires and bushfires, is some of the worst, right? It's actually, on health impacts, you can see bigger effects from bushfire smoke for respiratory problems than from car exhaust related pollution for the equal amount of particles, because particles come with a whole suite of other chemicals, and that varies. The point is it varies minute by minute, day by day. They're all reacting with each other. They stay suspended in the air basically till the rain comes. So what's in it? You can take this smoke and you can get really simplistic and say, well, there's the particles that are suspended and then all the different gases. The particles are largely elemental and organic carbon, bit of ash, bit of dust, salt, fertiliser, there's a few other things. The gases, as I said, there's hundreds of them, but you can divide them into groups. Inorganic acids, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, ozone and nitrogen compounds, well-known health impacts. The hydrocarbons, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, some of the most carcinogenic compounds we know, right? PAHs, benzene, toluene, organic molecules, that's volatile organic compounds, a whole suite of them. I've just given a couple of examples. Depending on what's burning, we actually don't get a lot of metals in the smoke we get here in Darwin. Okay, so what happens? You breathe in air and it's got a few of these particles in it. These are photos from various research projects I've done over the years in kids and adults where we've been able to do tests in clean air and smoky air, compare what happens. They totally fit with what we found in Australia with bushfire smoke, with the vast amount of research globally on air pollution from all sources, particle air pollution. But basically what happens is you get these small, immediate immunological and stress-related changes. So your body will react to it as though it's a foreign body or a virus or an injury, and it will go into repair mode. And that'll be a lot of inflammation. That's one of the main human processes. So there'll be more blood there, there'll be more cells that fight infections there. Some of those cells will release what we call reactive oxygen species. That's also known as oxidative stress. It's a good mechanism if you want to kill a virus. It's not a good thing to have going on in your lungs all the time because it increases cancer risk. In your blood, you'll see higher markers of inflammation. The tendency of the blood to clot will be just shifted a tiny bit. And again, these are really hard to pick up, but you can take blood, you can see these changes. In an individual, it's actually very small. Healthy person like me, none of this actually matters that much. It'll happen and then it'll go back, and it's part of living. You know, we're always going to have stresses and viruses and smoke. The issue is how long it goes on for and your underlying risk, and I'll talk to that in a moment. So increased blood pressure, reduced heart rate variability. You know, monitors you have on little babies, monitors their heart rate variability. It's a sign of physiological stress. And blood vessels, which we need to sort of perfuse all our organs, perfuse the heart, react less favourably when there's a bit of smoke in the air. So what does that mean clinically? Okay. In the short term, it means if you're already at high risk, so if you already have asthma, your lungs are sensitive, if you're already at high risk of a heart attack, if you're already at high risk of a stroke, if you have diabetes and your blood glucose isn't that well controlled, it can be what tips the balance to a severe asthma attack, cardiac arrest, a heart attack, a stroke, a hypoglycemic episode. Even though it makes glucose go up, it makes it less stable. Ambulance call-outs go up for hypoglycemia and diabetic problems the same day that air pollution goes up. And there's been a whole lot of studies now on concentration and attention, which is worse when it's more smoky, more particles in the air than when it's not. So they're the short-term exacerbations that you would expect to go back. The long-term is actually a bit more worrying because it's a chronic stress. It's like any other chronic risk factor for a chronic disease, like your cholesterol being too high, like having unfavourable genetics with your family history, like having your blood pressure too high or higher than, you know, what it might be otherwise. These are all small risk factors on their own, but it's one more. So it adds to your profile of risk, and the rest of your risk profile is actually really important. But at the end of the day, communities with higher pollution have higher rates of type 2 diabetes, cerebrovascular disease, you know, like strokes, and dementia, Alzheimer's, including vascular dementia, heart disease, asthma, chronic lung disease. Again, it's small, but at a population level, when millions of people, because that's the thing about air, it's not just one or two people lighting a fire, it's the whole population, those who are vulnerable and those who are not. So basically, that's a picture showing subtle influences, but everywhere. So who's at high risk? I've alluded to most of this. The point I want to make, so anyone with any underlying illness, extreme younger age before birth, prenatal in the first years of life, especially older age, and any kind of disadvantage. So the high risk groups for ill health anyway. But for air quality, we're getting close to half the population there. So that's why it's important. It's all these small changes affecting large numbers of people. Okay, so now I've been talking what happens at an individual level. I want to step back a bit and think like public health terms. Let's think about a population level and the relative impacts. So this is Sydney during some planned burning to control bushfire risk in, I think it was 2016. And we did a lot of modelling of the impacts and we did a lot of empirical studies of the impacts. But basically, everyone will get exposed and everyone, it's drawn as a pyramid, will have those physiological changes. That's just what happens. And some people will get symptoms. A lot of us, like your eyes start hurting, you know, regardless of your underlying health. But if you have asthma, for example, you could get symptoms straight away. And even with a very small rise, you'll get symptoms. With lungs, you know straight away. People know about smoke and lung disease. You feel it straight away. With heart disease and heart attacks, you don't feel the symptoms. Your blood might be more likely to clot. You don't know that. So you don't feel anything until you've got a major event and you're up at the top hospital admissions and deaths. Most deaths are heart, not lung related with air quality. They're all important. You know, and you can plot, in Canada, they actually plot salbutamol dispensations as a proxy marker for air quality in regions they haven't got air quality monitors, so that it's that sensitive. So a hypothetical for you now on absolute numbers. So that's how it's spread out. Let's do a thought experiment. This is taken from aerator this morning, right? So this is our air quality here right now in the last 24 hours, hour by hour. The green ones here are normal, but that's what most of Australia gets. That's what we would have here in the wet season. And then anything coloured is above background, and anything in the darker colour is above 25, which is the daily standard. So probably, you know, EPA will tell us in the end we're pretty close to having an exceedance of the standard. It's arbitrary whether there was an exceedance or not, but that's roughly the rise about 20 above background. So that's what we've had. You know, we've had it a few times already. We've had a lot below, we've had a lot higher. So hypothetically, let's imagine that amount of pollution for one day at 24 hours affecting a population, and I'm using a population that like Adelaide of 1 million because I know the numbers. The effects here, of course, will be smaller. We're 150,000, right? But let's just imagine it was that amount of pollution that we've all lived through for the last 24 hours. There's been burn-offs in the Adelaide Hills and Adelaide got it, not us. So what would the absolute numbers of all these things I've been telling you about look like in that population? So it's just, there's differences in underlying risk. There's all sorts of differences. This is based on data of Australian populations. Darwin has a much higher risk population mix than most of Australia. But you would probably count deaths in the order of units. There might not be any, there might be one, there might be three, but it's that kind of order of magnitude. If it went for 2 days, you know, maybe there's two. Darwin, it might be one every 10 days, but Darwin, you wouldn't expect a death in the last 24 hours from smoke alone, if that was all it was. But admissions to hospital, ED presentations, ambulance call-outs, you'd all be counting in the tens. GP visits, pharmacy visits in the hundreds, and symptoms tens of thousands. Okay, another thought experiment. What if we had exactly the same amount of pollution that we've had? What if it goes on for a whole year, right? 365 days in a year, and we're still in Adelaide, but it's been like that all year round. How many deaths might we expect? Anyone want to hazard a guess?
116, right?
Good guess. So that's short term. It would be perfectly reasonable to think Adelaide might expect an extra 365 deaths because of that pollution every day. The reality is, and it comes back to a point I made earlier, that it wouldn't be 365, it would be 3,600. It's 10 times more. The effect of the chronic stress on the body of progressing disease and putting more people in high-risk groups is way more important than a short-term fluctuation. So the short-term daily fluctuations have a much lesser impact than the chronic pollution. So that's where we're up against it in Darwin, right? It's not 365 days a year, but it's half the year, and it affects our chronic burden. Because we rarely get extreme events like in Sydney with bushfires. That's unusual. We just get chronic fluctuations because we live with fire, because we live in a tropical savanna that burns. So it's an important, I'm trying to convince you it's important for the health of the population. How are we going? Am I going on too long? Not too bad, I'll wind up soon. This is another important point to make. This is real data from British Columbia on presentations for asthma at different concentrations of PM pollution, starting from 0, and this is the relative risk of needing healthcare for asthma, so 1.5, 50% increase in presentations for asthma at a concentration of around 25, 30, like what we've had, and that's hourly, right? And then it goes up to 100, and this is a pattern you see with every air pollution related problem. It goes up really steeply from baseline and then it plateaus. So you might think if the pollution is 10 times worse, you might get 100 times more asthma presentations, you know, if we're out there. But in reality, you might, instead of going from 10 to 100, you might go from 10 to 20. So here in Darwin, we're sort of operating in this part of the curve. You can reassure yourself we're much better off than Beijing or Delhi, but in terms of health impacts, we're sort of approaching halfway there because of this steep and then plateauing. And people with severe, populations with severe pollution have to go a very long way before the population benefits really kick in. Excuse me. Okay, very briefly, having delivered the bad news, I can't end without giving strategies for managing it. But I'll be quick here. The key thing is managing chronic medical conditions and coincident risk factors. If you're living in a smoky environment, you need to do everything about regular exercise, healthy diet, proactively looking after your heart disease if you've got it, medication management reviews, all those things become really important because you've got to work on what you can change as an individual. One of my long-term studies after the Hazelwood coal mine fire, a community got 6 weeks of bad smoke. We've been following them for 10 years. 8 years after the fire, those who had a diet higher in fresh fruit and veg and were exposed to smoke had better lung function than those who didn't have a diet high in fresh fruit and veg. We were able to show a link between dietary patterns and long-term impacts, even after a short pollution episode. So don't underestimate the importance of diet and exercise and looking after yourselves or your patients. Keeping informed so you can plan when to do things indoors where it's air conditioned, which offers some protection, and when to go out. You know, managing your chronic everyday exposure is what you need to aim for. A great way to do it in Darwin, if you can afford it, if you're in a high risk group, if you do have a chronic disease, is use your air conditioner and air cleaner every night. If you run that every night, you spend half your life in that room, you're dramatically reducing your year-long exposure to particles without really changing what you do day to day. You can put on a mask, that's effective too. What should agencies do? Okay, look after individuals. If you're doing a planned burn, tell people in advance so they can at least take their preventer and close their doors and take action. Don't just fog the place and put out a smoke alert like happens all around Australia. Detailed education about what to do. We've got online courses, living with fire, bushfire smoke in your health, free, accessible, supportive policies so those who can't afford it can have access to air filters, masks, cleaner and cooler air spaces when needed. And then I'm going to controlling sources and managing fire for air quality mitigation is a big thing and a challenge for Darwin. And that's where Darwin needs to go, is really think about how the savannas are burning, because we have institutionalised savanna management going on, and there is a huge opportunity to improve the health of Darwin through that system. I'll hand to David. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, so what I want to do is I want to not talk about the carbon schemes. Okay, that's a separate box. I'm going to talk about the pyrogeography of the smoke, but I'll necessarily have to talk about the carbon schemes. I'm not going to talk about whether they're effective or not effective. I'm just going to talk about potentially what role they're playing in this chronic problem. Now, this goes forward, and very simple thing. I want to know, how has the smoke changed? I want to know where the smoke comes from. There's some discussion about that. I want to drill into that. I want to talk about other factors that have changed, and I want to make some philosophical points about how we progress this, because I'm a scientist, and scientists have a really cool philosophy about how to solve complex problems, and we need to remind ourselves about that. So the work that I'm discussing is complex work. There are 2 papers. If you'd like to read them, you can email me or you can get them. We've really looked at this in great detail, and we would be thrilled, as I'll explain, if anybody can find faults for these papers, improve these papers. Awesome. I'm really into that. We'll discuss that in a minute. So how has smoke changed in Darwin? And this is using a reconstructed time series based on airport visibility. I had the insight, I think I published a paper with a few people in 2006, where we realised there was a relationship between measured PM in the Darwin airshed and airport visibility, which unlocked a larger time frame. Now, I want to draw your attention to some squiggly lines here, because what's really nice about it is that we have 3 time series that all are strongly correlated. Very important. We have the instrumental record, that's very pleased to say an ARC linkage led to a monitoring system, which is ongoing. That's real data. Then we have the reconstructed from airport visibility. And then we have another very important data stream, which is monthly optical depth data from a satellite, which means that we can think about smoke at a geographical scale. What we see is that if you look at overall, it doesn't really seem, since the 1960s, to be a big change, which is curious given that the whole carbon schemes are meant to be about a big change. But what we do see is that in the early dry season, there is a trend, certainly in the last decade, increasing air pollution. And there's an interestingly a corresponding decrease in the late dry season, which is exactly what you would expect if you were doing an intervention to change the season of burning. So that's an important observation. So how has air pollution changed? In Darwin, well, the season has changed recently. That's the message. That's or I would say, the irrefutable fact from the available data. I'm open to anybody showing me other data that shows that that interpretation is wrong. So where does it come from? Where's all the smoke coming from? Now, I mentioned the optical depth data, which is a satellite, and that satellite data is rather cool because it's geographical. Now, there has been a meme that is, oh, the smoke pollution in Darwin's a local effect. It's just the gamba grass, it's just local. Well, that's actually a hypothesis you can test with geographical data. Let's test it. So we take the air pollution in Darwin from the optical depth and we correlate it to every cell surrounding Darwin, and we plot a gradient of significant correlations. White is insignificant. And what we see is that there is a significant association. When the air pollution in Darwin is bad, it's actually bad regionally. So regional effect. It's not, yes, of course, gamba grass would make air pollution in Darwin local effect, but it is a regional effect. I invite anybody to dispute that with the available data. But in the late dry season, that regional effect disappears. Now, that would have to ask a question, why is that so? What would be the mechanism? One of the things scientists do is they have to think of mechanisms. What would be the mechanism? And the mechanism is the wind field. There's a phenomenon, the southeasterly trades related to the high pressure system that sits on the continent. Unfortunately for Darwin, it happens to be strategically located at the lee side of the southeasterlies. So if there is a large amount of burning occurring in the surrounding savannas, in the early dry season particularly, the smoke will be transported to the Darwin airshed. And you can see this, it's a perfect example from the EPA report of smoke quite some distance from Darwin being transported direct line of sight. And you can imagine, and we have analysed in the Ambio paper, these hotspots are occurring in the dry season, particularly the early dry season, and they're transporting all of this smoke. So we're having a regional smoke effect. So what's changed? Why would this be happening? So we can see a number of changes. The amount of burnt area is declining. That's good, potentially good. But the amount of early season burning, particularly we differentiate between project areas, it's about half of the top end now being used for these carbon schemes, particularly in the early dry season. That's what they're predicated to do. There is a corresponding decline in the late dry season. That's the point. So, you know, that's something that's changed. I think we'll all agree with that. In fact, those results are often promoted as the success of this program. But some other weird things have happened too. We're seeing the intensity of the fires increasing. That's odd. The intensity is increasing. As a scientist, you have to say, why is that so? Why would it be increasing? And then we looked at the FRP, the satellites, where we look at the intensity pre and post these schemes, and we can see this increase, particularly on the project areas. It's interesting because that's in the early dry season. And what we also notice is that the inferred fuel moisture is actually, the landscape's getting drier. It's getting drier. What? And as a scientist, you have to ask the question, why would it be getting drier? Because what's the point of the carbon schemes? Climate change. Climate change, like we believe in climate change, right? That's what the schemes are about. Well, if you believe in climate change, you believe in increasing temperatures. If you believe in increasing temperatures, you believe in the vapor pressure deficit. The vapor pressure deficit is the capacity of the atmosphere to draw moisture out of fuel, which means that you would be creating drier fuels. And in fact, this is what we see. We're seeing a shift in the timing of the intensity of fires. This is by month, and we've split these between the project and non-project areas, pre and post. And we're seeing it's a complex plot, but basically what we're seeing is that we're advancing the late dry season because of the drying of the fuels, which is leading to increased intensity. So there seems to be something going on with the actual climate. There's a climate effect here. There's an interaction, right? So let's summarise, because I have to be quick. Small overall increase in pollution, but markedly so in the early dry season, as we expected. The fuels are drier and hotter, particularly in the early dry season. So there's higher intensity of project areas. Maybe they're getting overburnt. Maybe there's a grass fire cycle. So the mechanisms, there's something to do with the carbon schemes. There's southeasterly winds and these drier fuels. That's certainly what we're seeing. So I wanted to just very briefly reflect on scientific practice. A lot of what I told you is correlative. You need to get out into the field. I'm a field guy. Okay, is it really true that the fuels are getting drier? Are the fuels changing? What are the effects? When I read the literature, I also just read a whole lot of correlative stuff. I'm not seeing a lot of data about the change which is being caused by these schemes. Yes, there was some in the 1990s. Hey, that's a long time ago. We need to think about the dryness of the fuels. We need to think about how that dryness may be changing through the dry season. And we need to be particularly thinking about whether that mechanism, the dryness, is changing the emission factors. What do I mean by that? The emission factors would mean that drier fuels are burning differently. Maybe the larger fuel elements, the coarse woody debris, particularly, maybe burning, that smouldering combustion, particularly, might mean that we're actually priming the landscape to be producing an enormous quantity of smoke, which means that any system that is predicated on a binary on the 1st of August, it's suddenly a different day to before the 1st of August, that is not adaptive. That's not an adaptive system. If you are in a climate change business, the thing you must have is adaptability. And if you have black letter law, it is a rule that you will be rewarded if you burn before this day and you will be penalised if you burn after this day. That doesn't sound terribly adaptive to me. I'm sorry, that's not a smart way of doing carbon storage. Another philosophy is let's be sceptical. Be sceptical of what I'm saying, but let's be sceptical of the official line. Right? That's how science progresses, skepticism. Let's value feedback and diversity of opinions. Don't try to shut it down with groupthink. Sorry, that doesn't work. The diversity of opinions must be ventilated, and if you suppress them, eventually they will bubble up and potentially you'll get some serious blowback. A spotlight is now being put on wildfire in carbon accounting globally. There's grave concerns that wildfire may be one of the mechanisms, like the destruction of ice sheets, that could be the cause of the accelerating rate of climate change. So that carbon accounting with fire is a very hot topic. And the last point is let's not do rhetoric, let's do data. I've done some data. You don't like my interpretations? Great. I want to see your data. I want to see your analysis. Let's actually see this debate progress as a scientific issue, not an issue of politics and rhetoric. Thank you.
So much. We are right on time. We still have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. We've got one online, but if you'd like to open up to the room as well.
Yes, straight away to your data. So the satellite data, you talked about aerosol optical depth from satellite. The satellite measures total column. So the satellite doesn't distinguish whether it's on the ground or whether it's in a couple of kilometers high. So I think that's, in this case, an important thing to consider.
Can I just make the point that was the Von estimates that were validated for ground level. They were estimates of PM 2.5 based on a model.
And also,
based on AOD.
we
So it was
showed
ground level,
in the
okay.
time series that
AOD alone, you're right.
those values were correlated with the instrumental observations in Darwin. That was the point.
I'm not disputing that there might be correlations, but the thing is what the satellite measures is the total column. Yeah. And you might see some correlations, but that doesn't mean what a satellite measures is what you think it measures. And the other satellite observation, FRP, is not fire line intensity. It's something completely different. That's the total energy released in an area. It's not fire line intensity.
Yes.
So you can't use that as a surrogate.
We can by area, because it's a lot of little fires or it's one big
But
fire.
it's not in fire line intensity.
Not fire line, no.
So
area.
if you measure a different FRP, that doesn't mean it's a different fire intensity. The other thing is whether fuel moisture is affecting emission factors. We've done some measurements and that's published.
Yeah, they're very old as far as I can see. They were Mick Myers. And I would be suggesting,
Well, we measured under different.
but I would be suggesting that you really need to start looking more critically at whether, you know, my hypothesis is that it is getting drier. I think that the changing fuel elements are probably contributing to this extra burden of smoke pollution.
I mean, obviously there are a lot of other factors than just as simple.
Let's let other people talk, and you guys take it offline later.
Yep.
Keith's got a question.
Oh, yeah, so thanks for that. Yeah, you partly, I think, answered it just then, but I was interested in this question, are fuels getting drier? So if somebody started measuring it today, do the comparable data, old data exist that, from 20 years ago or so or more?
So what you can do is you can look at vapor pressure deficit values, and we've published recently a global analysis of fuel dryness, which looks at a form of vapor pressure deficit, basically. And that's a global trend, and it makes perfect sense because we're warming. So, Darwin's getting hotter, everywhere it's getting hotter. So the atmosphere is having an increasing capacity to store water. But what I would like is actually some field measurements, and there are some technologies, eye buttons, for instance, where you can actually put them into the field and we could start looking at seasonal patterns of fuel dryness. That would be something that I would be recommending doing.
Okay, Natalie Robb for that. So I would agree with your suggestion there that the fuel being drier and that fuel dryness changing dramatically over the last 20 years. We've got data over the period. We're definitely seeing that. So not only gamma graphs changing the fuel loads and structure, but also changing the fuel dryness. The thing that I find interesting, that I would argue that the Bureau of Meteorology don't take into account that curing data effectively at all. And I had a classic example 2 days ago where it's, plus 3 windy, it was clearly drier. And when I looked at the actual fire danger for that day, it was the lowest you could possibly get. So it's not even close to a fire ban. We ended up having wildfires that day. So there's just this total mismatch. It's totally, the Bureau of Meteorology just has, I would argue, very limited capacity to correctly predict fire danger.
Jenny?
I was just going to say too, so, I mean, we live in the tropical savannas, so we get that monsoonal, we get an annual reset with our moisture loads every year. So what you're seeing is that shifting of that window for those gentle, low intensity burns. And that's the thing, particularly in this Darwin, Katherine, Western Top End area, particularly probably in the time even since you haven't been up here, that's actually shifted much earlier. And so I noticed in the paper you've got that early dry season window is May to July and then, August to October. And actually for Darwin and Katherine, it's already shifted into, March and April should be the time that you're actually ceasing burning in this greater Darwin area. And you mentioned earlier about the traditional burning practices and people focusing on those seasonal calendar things. And what are the plants doing? How are they responding? How are they flowering? And so actually using the landscape signals rather than the monthly signals and then applying that into the landscape. And absolutely that's something that the Greater Darwin area needs to be looking at, colleagues in Arnhem Land and elsewhere for that knowledge to actually bring that in to make that a much stronger focus of how fire is managed in this mosaic of Darwin rural area.
Yeah, a really, really important comment, very sensible.
Do you want
I work on water, so I think a lot more about water than I do about fire. But I'm wondering if, some of the predictions are for increased rainfall and certainly more intense storms. And so that would fuel vegetation growth. So is that part of the story with more intensity, is that you're actually getting, even if things are getting drier, you're actually getting more primary production that would fuel more intense fires? Does that seem a logical also climate change?
So one of the things we notice with these differences between the schemes, and particularly the fire FRP values, and there could be a couple of explanations for that. One of the dangers, this talk, remember, is about health, the pressing concern of an air quality problem in Darwin. I need to remind you, it's not about the carbon schemes, but one of the concerns I would have is that the mission statement might have got mutated and through perverse incentives. And so the incentivization of burning everything rather than the incentivization of storing carbon. So, you know, you get incentives to burn things early in the dry season. Well, an economically rational actor will burn as much land as possible. And that might be driving a grass fire cycle, which might be changing the fuel arrays. And that's one of the really key things for all of these schemes, is absolutely critical, not only to be adaptive, but also to be doing the monitoring and not flying around in helicopter monitoring, boots on the ground measuring things and tracking things, and not being concerned that you might actually change your practice. I mean, that's called adaptation. But what I think has happened, because, you know, there's a lot of money at stake, they've baked in a fairly simplistic formula, which can then lead to perverse outcomes that even practitioners are going, well, this doesn't feel right, but the instructions tell me I've got to do it.
Yeah.
Whereas what would be better, and what Jenny is saying, is to have a bit more flexibility to allow people to start fine-tuning, saying, well, you know what, there seems to be a lot of grass up there, and if we chill, we might be able to let that grass settle a bit rather than burning it to get more grass. And then, of course, you're priming the landscape for weed invasions, particularly gamba grass. So I notice, you know, that gamba grass is really beginning to escape, like out into Litchfield, and the more burning you're doing, you're priming a landscape to be receptive to a super grass fire cycle, not just a native grass fire cycle. So there just needs to be, I think, that's what I'm saying, you know, like, let's just get out there and do stuff. And there's some really cool natural experiments. If you've got project schemes adjacent to non-project schemes, is it true that there's a difference in fuels? The inference we're making from remote sensing might be complete bullshit. I don't know. Let's find out. But that's the cool thing about adaptation and science and monitoring, that you can actually resolve these things. I don't think there's any disagreement with the use of fire to manage savannas and have schemes to store carbon, but you've got to be concerned if you're exposing large population centres to serious health outcomes.
Can I just, we've only got 5 minutes. Are there any health related questions from my end?
Mine's a hybrid. So if there's pure health, do you go first?
1, 2, 3, maybe? And I'll try and be quick.
Okay, so air pollution is a problem in Darwin due to fires, but we've also got a large gas industry, particularly LNG production, right in the heart of Darwin, with companies right now releasing enormous volumes of volatile organic compounds and other pollutants, which are very similar to the fire pollutants. What's the I guess, risk to the Darwin population of both an expanding gas industry and this changing fire practice? And does something need to be done? Do they cancel each other out? You know, can we afford any more pollutants in our air?
So short answer is no, you need to work towards reduction, and anything that's going to increase it, it would be incredibly hard to justify, in my view. To know exactly the relative impacts on health. Fires are so enormous, it will be hard to see the effect of other things, but you're not going to know till you've got very clear monitoring. And we lack that data, so it's hard for me to give a clear answer.
There's no monitoring of air toxics in Darwin either. There's monitoring of the PM2.5 and others, but no monitoring.
Which is, I'll say, that is consistent with EPA practices around the country. But you've got an issue here, so you've got a case. That's what I would say. Sorry to rush, but I just wanted to give health questions a chance, yeah.
So everything that people have said has been really important, and I'm also thinking about post-COVID, and the fact that evidence suggests, particularly with women, that autoimmune diseases are on the rise worldwide. And I can just imagine from your part of the talk that things like, elevated eosinophils, all sorts of syndromes would be part of this scenario, which is on the rise. So my question is, everything that everyone said, including the need to change, because we're still stopping on June 30 instead of earlier, the managed burns, who do we go to? What are we going to do to make a difference? And I know we've got decision makers in the room. What do we do when the Chief Minister says you either have all of this, including the gas stuff, or you don't have health and you don't have education? I mean, it's so simplistic. What do we do? Who do we go to? What do we influence? With all this fabulous data I'm talking.
I guess as a scientist, I contribute by doing good science. I can't really advise you on governance in the NT. Influencing policy, I know I've worked in policy, it's a long and complex process and it requires a lot of communication and a lot of sort of building trust and working together, and you hope that the agencies and the universities and all the people involved would be coming together to discuss this. That's what I would like to see happen in Darwin. I actually have no idea how it's happening. I can tell you there's very good evidence that more pollution in the air is associated with more severe respiratory pandemics, including COVID, like there are links everywhere.
What I would say is that the NT government initially supported our work on air pollution in Darwin. It's had very strong support from politicians. And I think politicians, in my experience, can understand human suffering. So if you can explain, and that's why I think the real freight of this, if you can explain that about half of your population is suffering, right? And that there are solutions to that suffering, and those solutions will carry not only lifestyle benefits, making people feel good because they're not injuring people. We now know that people are being injured, willfully being injured. So, that's a motivation to improve things. It's not like we didn't know, we do know that. But also there will be really substantial financial benefits. And that's interesting to match those financial benefits against the financial benefits of the carbon schemes, because that's been one of the selling points of the carbon schemes, is that it's an income stream. But one of the consequences of all of this smoke is it's actually a huge drag on the health system. And I think if you can explain that to politicians, that will resonate and will help them understand that, hey, we're not talking about shutting anything down. We're just talking about fine-tuning something to get some better outcomes where everybody will win. Like we can actually have it all, but you have to have an adaptive system, and you've got to have a system that's open to change. But if this is a monolithic binary, I wish you luck, because actually it's only going to get worse.
Thank you.
Last 3 minutes, I think.
Yeah, we have quite a few questions and comments coming in online, so we probably won't get to all of them, and we can provide them to you afterwards, but just to highlight a couple. Melissa is wondering, do we know the break point between the benefits of outdoor physical activity and the harms of air pollution, especially for vulnerable individuals, and how do we handle that over the long term?
The short answer is no, but exercise at an individual level is incredibly good for you. And for low level fluctuations of pollution, the benefit of exercise is likely to outweigh, like on low to fair, right at the bottom of that curve. Exercise will probably outweigh the harms of the pollution. But that's an educated judgment on my part. We don't actually know it. There's only 1 or 2 studies, and they're all in particular circumstances that are hard to generalise.
If I could raise another one, this is from Annie. How do we think the middle arm development might impact Darwin and Palmerston air quality?
We need the monitoring. In amongst the rest of it, it will be hard to know.
Now we've got one more question.
Dave, when you did your analysis, did you actually do a month-by-month analysis of the changes in the environment? Because the reason I ask is that over years, I think that July fires are no longer July fires anymore, if that makes sense.
That's exactly what I think we did do. And that was our concern. And that's probably the biggest maladaptive step, is baking in a date, this arbitrary definition of an early and late dry season. It's such a classic Canberra thing. And it's sort of just, you know, as I pointed out when I gave some evidence to a committee, I mean, that's like the ultimate sort of maladaptive thing. If you believe in climate change and then you actually tether a definition of a season to a rigid calendar date, and what Jenny was saying, a really important point, is that Indigenous folk do have actual biological calendar systems.
I would just point in too that the method is just measuring methane and nitrous oxide. So that date, there's nothing in the method that says anything about fire management or when to do it.
Yeah.
It's just when one sort of calculations switch from one to the other. Yeah. So if you're actually burning according to your landscape and your features, you're doing it well before that cut-off date. Not that there's even a cut-off date. And there's some projects in Queensland that need to burn in August and September because they have different climate cycles, and that's when their fuel is secured enough to get. So it's, yeah, the method isn't actually, you know, rigid in the fire management sense. It's just when the calculations, they calculate nitrous oxide.
That's right. But it does seem to be rewarding perverse behaviours, and particularly you can have a race, you know, to meet a target. And you know, we could drift into the biodiversity argument, is that, hey, I reckon a more interesting challenge for land managers is, how about you actually get some really long unburnt vegetation in the savannas? Because, you know, if you made that something you would reward, that's like bitcoins. That's a very difficult thing to do. To have, let's say, I'll give you a lot of money if you can have a 20-year patch of unburnt savanna, because you pretty well can't do it. And the way you can get long unburnt elements, certainly from our studies in Arnhem Land, it's by very fine scale patch burning. That's about the only way you can do it in a highly flammable environment. And, you know, respectfully, again, one of these things with satellites, early dry season burning mosaics, yeah, but, you know, if you go back in time, they were using very coarse satellites, which we can't get that grain. Now we've got better satellites, we could actually start really focusing on the amount of long unburnt elements and rewarding that. So there's fantastic scope for innovation and improvement of the schemes. And that's why I'm saying, you know, don't get stuck in a rhetorical cycle. We need evidence, we need diversity of opinion, ventilation, discussion. And that's how we can actually make this thing sing.
One more, then more.
After you.
Wrap it up. One last question.
I don't know how.
Yeah.
You haven't.
Yes, yeah. You know, we all know that biodiversity is crashing in Kakadu and Arnhem Land, and its major contributor is the fire. We all know that for years, and it keeps getting monitored year after year. Oh yeah, it's going down, it's going down. Nothing happens. I'll monitor it again next year. But the whole paradigm of this early dry season burning, I mean, to me, it's, if you're out there in the field and you see a fire in the early dry season, there's 4 or 5 metre high flames. I mean, that's not a cool burn to me. Everything's destroyed. There's got to be a shift towards this dry season, I mean, wet season burning, early wet season burning. There's plenty of evidence coming through now that it's much more effective in reducing the grass load. You've seen the studies I'm talking about.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, one of the things that ecologists, you know, the penny's beginning to drop, that biodiversity does actually need long unburnt elements in the landscape, and they're becoming as rare as rocking horse poo. So, you know, creating those elements in the landscape, that's, to me, sophisticated fire management, and that's exactly what Indigenous burning was able to achieve. So that's really, I think, the frontier. To get those habitat mosaics back, you'll get a lot more biodiversity. You can see around the campus here, the long unburnt savannas aren't savannas, they're dry forests. They're beautiful, you know, leafy communities, and we should have more of those because there's so many co-benefits for a lot of wildlife, particularly fruit-eating creatures and animals that need to shelter from heat under leaves, for instance. Even the reptiles can benefit from these longer unburnt landscapes.
All right, I think we're going to have to leave it there. I know there's a lot more questions, but we've still got time to discuss at morning tea.